So for the agenda for today is we're going to do I'm going to walk you through an overview of practical tips and tricks for when you're doing panel layouts for both 2D and which will apply for both 2D and 3D panel layouts, as well as I'm going to go over an overview of what Eplan offers, both on the 2D side, Electrical PA 2D, as well as the Pro panel. For the 2D panel layout demo, we're going to go over gear tray configuration, how we place our DIN and trunking, and how we place the components onto our DIN efficiently, fastly, as well as key settings to maximize efficiency, and how we place enclosure legend reports on a page. For the 3D panel layouts, we're going to go over how to create your own layout space, so you can insert your enclosure and any accessories, as well as once the enclosure is inserted, how do we place DIN, how do we place trunking, how do we place devices on our DIN, because it is different compared to how it is in 2D. And we'll also go over drilling views, model view, drilling view, how to place those views on paper space. And we'll go over our API tool, panel layout generator, which you can use for both 2D and 3D panels. And then afterwards, the Q&A. So best practices. So before you even begin to do your panel layouts, whether it's 2D or 3D, you first have to have a schematic already drawn up in Eplan with all your parts, all wired properly and everything. Then you can begin to plan it out. And when you are planning, you need to comply with standards. So for example, if you're doing work in New Zealand, we follow the AES NZS 3000 standard, 2018 being the latest version. Whereas if you're in Europe, you would be using IEC. If you're in the US, you would use UL. And yeah, plan your layouts before you mount and wire. So first, one big thing is when you're choosing your panel, you need to consider the IP rating. And that's going to be affected by where your panel is placed. Is this panel going to be placed indoors? Is it going to be placed outdoors? Will it be in a dry environment? That will determine your water safety, dust protection level, or IP. You also need to consider cable entry. So usually your cables will either come in from the bottom of the panel or from the top, and that will affect where your terminals will be. So, if it's bottom entry, terminals will be at the bottom. You could also have it be both. So like incoming power can come from the top, and then outgoing power or outgoing cables can be from the bottom. You also want to consider positioning of the main isolator e-stop HMI. So there's two factors to consider. The first factor will be heights. So for your main isolator, especially if you're going to have a door handle, you want to have somewhere between 0.6 and 1.9 meters above the ground for your isolator. Ideally 1.7 meters, somewhere eye level and within arm's reach. You don't want it to be too tall so no one can reach. And this will also apply with any e-stops and HMI. You want it to be around eye level so an average person can reach it. The second factor, and this mainly affects the main isolator, will be the horizontal positioning. So what I mean by that is, for example, in this panel here, this panel will have two doors. So therefore, I'm going to place my isolator on the right side, which the right door will be my opening door. Therefore, I'm going to place it close to where it opens on the opening side, on the opening door. Another good consideration is to segregate your power and control. Because high power devices, especially like VSDs or even just power cables, they will emit EMI, and you don't want that EMI to have any impact on your control circuits or control wires. And a good habit is to allow space for future expansion. Like in the image below, you can see I've allocated spares for some VSDs. But it's not just VSDs you have to consider. You also have to consider maybe I might have an extra DOL in the future. Maybe I'll need an extra PLC card. And if I have an extra PLC card, I might need an extra 24-volt DC fuse to cover it. So just those things to consider. Next is the component layouts. So a bit of common sense is you want to mount components securely on DIN rails, or in some cases, the mounting panel. Obviously, you don't want anything to fall off. You don't want anything to get loose, especially if your enclosure is mounted in a high vibration area or on a high vibration machine. You also don't want any wires to slip out. It's also a good idea to group components by their function. So, for example, you don't want your motor starters to interfere with the PLC section, stuff like that. And you want to keep heat generating components separated. So stuff like your VSD, which is going to be your big one. You don't want your VSDs to blow hot air into a PLC or a Ethernet switch. And while you're keeping the VSDs separated, you also need to think of mounting clearances for anything like VSDs or even power supplies. So typically with VSDs, we would go for like 100 mils, about 50 to 100 mils above and below the VSD. And maybe sometimes there might be side clearances. Of course, these are just typical values. You would have to check the data sheets to make sure you get the correct one. And then lastly, you want to ensure efficient wiring flow. So for example, in this blue box, there are 3 e-stop zones. So a circuit breaker going into 2 safety contactors, and you can see they're placed directly below each other in order to minimize the wiring. We don't want any wiring to be looped around back. So we want to keep the wires short, keep it simple. And then wiring and ducting. So it's recommended that you use slotted wire ducts or slotted trunking instead of solid. There's 2 reasons for this. The first reason is for airflow. You can get more air going into there. The second reason is if you use slotted, when you're doing your wiring, you have the option to snap off some of these sides, the side bits. And by snapping them off, you get more, you can have more space for any wires going into that go through the trunking. You also want to keep the ducts less than 50% full, mainly to allow, future expansion, like what I said in the previous slide. And it's a good idea to route your wires carefully. And you want to separate the power wires, or I guess AC, from the control, DC. And one good idea for that is you can have 2 trunking side by side, like what you see in the picture below. We have a low voltage or the power, and then we have the ELV, extra low voltage control. So it's a good idea to separate them. And when you're dealing with cables, cables in the MCC or going to the MCC from the field, you want to follow the minimum cable bend radius. So the formula for that is it's the cable factor times by the diameter. So typically, for example, like power cables, the cable factor will be 8 or 12, or 8 to 12. So 8 for unshielded, 12 for shielded. Of course, you will need to check the manufacturer data sheet for the actual values, but that's just somewhere. And of course, it's not just power cables you have to consider. You also have to consider like Ethernet cables, for example. They will have a factor of 4 and others. And on the topic of wires, you also want to you also want to keep wire colors consistent. And you want to make sure that whatever wire numbers you use, that they are visible, from that they are visible and you can see. So to make them visible, typically we have 50 mil spacing, from the components to the trunking above and below. And that just gives us some space so you can see them. And now for the labeling. So whenever you have a high voltage isolation or high like MCCB or the main isolator, definitely a very good idea to have some warning labels like what you see in the image below, danger. But it's not just the main isolator. It's also a good idea to have labeling for your earth bar, your neutral bar, your main switch, or even other power supplies or other like GPO. You also want to label all wires that you have in the MCC. It just makes wiring a lot easier, and also if an electrician needs to fix it. You also want to label terminals as well, so you know which terminal goes. So you know what to connect to each terminal, as well as good idea to have ordinary device labeled. And if you are going to label them, it's a good idea to look into UV stable or heat resistant labels, maybe even engrave them so they don't fall off. You also want to match, you want the device tags in your panel layout to match what's in the schematic. Now with Eplan, it's really easy to do this because you're dragging existing components onto the panel layout, so it shouldn't be a problem, but definitely something that you do need to keep in mind. And when you're done with your panel layouts, it's always a good idea to generate an enclosure legends, like what you see in this green table here. And the reason for the enclosure legend is, let's say if the Sparky wants to mount the 10Q1, he will see, okay, this is number 5. He will check it in the enclosure legend, and you'll know, okay, number 5, it's this part from this manufacturer. It just makes doing panel layouts a lot easier. Now, another thing to consider when you're doing your panel is the thermal consideration. So Eplan offers a free online tool called a Rytherm, and this allows you to input the heats generated from the components and the cabinet that you're using, and it's going to give you how much cooling that you need and options for which fans or AC you can select. And since you most likely will use a fan or an AC, it's also a good idea to use an exhaust grill or an outlet filter for those fans, just to clean out the air. You also don't want to block your cooling path. So in ProPanel, you can see ProPanel makes it super easy for you to see visually see where your airflow is going to be, or if anything's blocking it. So for example, you can see the blue arrow, you can see arrows here, as well as the trunking blocking here. And all the way to the right side, you can see the airflow path. So what this tells me is my third VSD is not receiving like, the full F, not being cooled properly. So now I have two options. I can either lower the AC, like position-wise, or I can use a flow diverter. So all VSDs are properly cooled. And you also want to do some grounding as well. So a bit of common sense, make sure your isolators, your CBs, MCCBs is properly sized, has the correct power rating. But it's not just that. You also want to make sure that your wires going to and from any protection devices are also properly sized so they don't burn up, as well as, pick a proper earth bar and then properly size your earth conductors as well. And if you are going to use earth bars or neutral bars, make sure you bond the earth bar to the gear tray. Then you can bond the gear tray to the panel itself. Metal enclosures, is all bonded for you, so it just makes it a lot easier. And as I've mentioned before, yeah, just label those protection devices like what you see here. Just makes it easier to understand what's in the panel. And mounting. So if your enclosure is going to be directly mounted onto like a conveyor or some other machine, and if that machine is going to be vibrating a lot, it's definitely a good idea to look into getting anti-vibration mounts just to help the panel be more secure. And it's also a good idea to drill and tap any mounting holes where you're going to be mounting the din and trunking, but also for stuff like VSDs, and use spring washers as well. If you have like something like a high voltage bus bar, it's recommended that you secure them with the correct torque setting. If they're too loose or too tight, the connection could end up slipping or could damage the bus bar. So I would recommend maybe use something like a torque wrench or something similar to get the correct torque setting. So how does all of this stack up? So these are all the features that you can use in 2D and Pro Panel, which is 3D. So for the 2D, it's pretty simple. It's just 2D panel layouts and enclosure legends. Pretty straightforward. And for the 3D, you get a lot more. So you can get stuff like thermal design calculations. You can visualize mounting clearances, which just gives you a reminder so you can see if any trunking is going on top, is going. You can also have wire routing, which is a big one. So this, basically what wire routing is Pro Panel does the wire routing for you, and you can generate a report of all the wiring used in the panel, as well as the color and lengths of each wire. And you can also do machining exports. So what I mean by that is, once you've done your 3D panel layouts, you can export this to a Perfix machine and then have the Perfix machine do all the drilling and tapping on the gear tray for you. And if you don't want to use a Perfix machine, you can export it as a DXF or SDP and use some other machine instead. And that's the main difference between, or feature difference between 2D and 3D, or Eplan P8 and Pro Panel, I should say. Okay, now I'll go over a live demo on how to do some panel layouts for both 2D and 3D. So if I open up Eplan, let me start from scratch. So before I jump into the panel layouts, I'm just going to briefly go over the schematic project. So you can see main isolator going to 3 e-stop zones. With this, each safety zone will have an MCB, 2 safety contactors. If we go next page, there's some panel utilities here, like GPO, a power supply, more DOLs, some VSD starters, PLC. I think you get the idea, pretty basic drawing. Okay, now we can start with the panel layouts. But before I'm able to place anything on the page, I need to insert what's called a mounting panel. So in Eplan, a mounting panel is simply this button here. It's a blue rectangle that allows me to place components onto the page. And then I can call this. And then this will be my external view. So now that I have it placed, I can simply drag stuff onto the page. And first thing I want to place is my enclosure. But in order to place my enclosure, I need to define the parts in my schematic project. I define it by going to a schematic page, like for example, the first page, and I create a black box or an invisible black box, like what you see with EBCC. If I go into it, you can see it's not a text, it's a black box with no width and height. And if I go to parts, here I've chosen my rotile cabinets, VX8204. You can also, below this, you can also choose other accessories. So stuff like the plinths, your front plinth, side plinths, side panels, divider plates, anything else that you need. You can even specify din and trunking over here if you want. So once that's done, we can go back to the external panel layout. And it's as simple, and we can begin. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to so I'm going to go to view, and I'm going to bring in my 2D panel layout navigator. So I can drag stuff on the page under all parts, demo. And these are all my components in the schematic project, and you can see MCC. And it's simply a matter of dragging MCC onto the page and placing it. Nice and easy. Well, I want to do a bit more. I also want to have some side views, like maybe a left view and a right view. So let's do that. So if I drag this out again, I just press tab to change the view. And I'm going to place the other side view as well. And I'm also going to place the gear tray as well. I can copy this and then paste it on the next page. However, now, if I look at my 2D navigator, I've got 1 tick and I've got 3 red dots. And the reason why I have 1 tick and 3 red dots is because, according to Eplan, I have 4 enclosures over here. And the reason why I have 4 enclosures is because I have 4 part placements. This one here, this is a part placement. And so is this one and the others. So what I need to do is I need to delete the extra part placements. I just need 1 part placement and everything else purely as a graphic. So I'm going to hold Shift so I can select individual objects in the group. Click on the 2, delete. Do the same for this one as well. Delete this. Do the same for the 3. And oh no, it's this one here as well. Yeah, okay. So that with that being done, you can see I've got one tick, no errors. My external panel view is looking good, that's correct. No errors. Now what I need to do next is I need to do the internal panel layout page. So I'm just going to cut this or Control X. And if I go to my internal page, I can paste that in here. So when you're doing these panel layout pages, you can specify page scaling. So if I right click on the page and go properties, I can see here is 1 to 10. If I do it for the internal, I can see it's also 1 to 10. If you want, I could have this be 1 to 8 instead of, I could make my internal 1 to 8 instead of 1 to 10. And the reason for doing this is so that the main internal view can be a lot bigger. But I'll stick to 1 to 10 for both, just for some consistency. But that is an option that you can do. Now that we have the gear tray in place, we need to do some din and trunking. And there's two ways to place din and trunking in the gear tray. Method one is you specify din and trunking parts under MCC or somewhere else, and then you can simply drag them onto the panel layout, resize them if you need to. And that's method one. Method number two, and this one's a bit more common, is you simply use rectangles to show your din and trunking. And of course, the rectangles, the din and trunking will have different formats, so you can tell them apart. So I'll be doing methods 2 for this webinar. And let me show you how to do it. If you go to Insert Graphic Gallery, we want this one rectangle. I'm going to zoom in. So if I click here, I could also click up here, and I'll click up here. And for my 2D, I'm going to say all trunking is going to be 50 mils wide. So I'll go some amount across, like 1300 across, and then 50 mils high. If I go oversize, like what you see here, that's not a problem, because I can simply resize it to the correct size. Once that's done, I'm going to copy this. Oh, sorry. Let me do this again. Copy. And then paste up here. And I've got my top and bottom trunking. Next, I can do some vertical trunking. So I'll go 50 and then some amounts going down. I'm typing this all in from the keyboard. And the advantages of using the input box to type in, values is it's a lot more, you get a lot more precision. You don't have to guess how much up and down. It just makes it a lot easier and faster to do it this way. And I can just copy this across. And I've got my outer trunking done. Now, what I need to do is I need to get some horizontal trunking and then the din between. And the spacing I want is I want 250 mils from the middle of this top one here to the middle of the next one, 250. And what I would do is go to insert a rectangle, place it directly on top, like what you see here. I will move the cursor here so I can type in the number. So 474.5. Now that I've placed mine directly on top. If I move it, so if I go edit and move, Make sure I've got selected the middle. And you can see as I move my mouse, the numbers in the input box changes. So I can just type in the distance I want, 0 space minus 250, enter. If I want to do a sanity check to make sure what I did is correct, I simply have to use the linear dimension. And I can see 250 mils. So what I've done is definitely correct. Now I want to place a DIN rail in here. So again, do the rectangle. And I'm looking for that middle point, to the red square. And unfortunately, there's no snapping point for me. So as a quick tangent, the way this snapping works is you can snap corners, you can snap the middle of an object, or intersection, or anywhere where it intersects. Since I don't have a middle point here, I'm going to make my own. So I'm going to draw a line. And this will allow me to snap a rectangle here. Instead of which I can draw, what I'm going to do instead, I'm just going to copy this over here. And I'm going to resize this to be 35 because my DIN is 35. I'm going to make this 35. And I'm going to go edit, move this down. And now I have my DIN placed perfectly in the middle. However, we're not done because at the moment, this DIN, it looks virtually identical to the trunking. There's no way to distinguish between them, or of course, apart from, the height. But we need to do more than that. So we're going to change the formatting. You can make a gray, you can make a watermark. Up to you. I also recommend you make it dashed as well. And then send this to the background. So go over here, background. And this looks much better. And then once you've done one, it's just a matter of copying and pasting or duplicating the rest of the way down and across. I won't do the whole panel, but I'll just show you how the duplicate works. So if you select and then go D for duplicates, and then you just select your reference point like over here, choose your quantity like 5, for example, you can see it copied all the way down. And if you made a mistake, you can always just delete. And yeah, that's how we do some simple DIN and trunking. So once the DIN and trunking is done, now we need to insert components onto our panel layouts. And there's 2 ways of doing this. So both ways involve going to all parts. Actually, no, so before we do that, we just need to insert a mounting panel first. So let me just do that quickly. Just going to insert it on top. I'll call this internal. Yep, and then this will allow us to insert components. Then you simply find the components you want, like let's say these contactors. You can do a group select or an individual select, and you simply drag them onto the page. I'm going to the very left, so I get in the center. And then once the first one's clicked, it's just a matter of you just keep clicking. They'll be placed right next to each other. If you don't like them placed all the way to the edge, You can always move them, press X on your keyboard so they're aligned, and you get something like this. Components placed. That's the first way of doing it. The second method is very similar. You select your components. You go right click, and this time you go place on mounting rail. You click the DIN, and you can see, for example, if I click up here somewhere, you can see it's automatically centering the device onto the DIN for me. This way it's much nicer because you don't have to place them all the way to the left. So there's pros and cons to both methods, but they will definitely give you the results you need. Yeah, that's how we place. So what we did what we just did now, creating the DIN and trunking, creating the panel layouts, there is a faster and more efficient way of doing this. And it's with a tool called the panel layout generator. And that tool is an API that we've made at EcoDesign and that we offer. So I'm going to show you how that tool works. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete what I've done here. And it's under the ESG, this panel generator under PLG Basic. So to use this tool, you select the 2 pages, or you can select any page, and you click on panel generator. And I'll just zoom in for you guys. So starting at the bottom, you can see this is where we're telling the app where we want to place the 2 pages. You can place them on existing pages or create new ones, or the tool can create a new one for you. We'll just place them on the existing pages. Once we've decided where to place, we need to choose our enclosure. So here, I've got a drop down of 2 enclosures I've used previously. If an enclosure is not on this list, you have the 3 dots to find an EMA file. Down here, you've got mounting panel width and height. This is done automatically for you. So you don't need to worry about these, but it's just there, just to give you some information. Trunking width, how wide is your trunking? I'll just leave it at 60. Trunking spacing, this is what we did for the horizontal ones, 250 from the middle to the middle, like what you see in this picture here. And then we can choose to do offsets from the top and bottom. So I'll give you an example. So I'll just do 50 so you can see what it looks like. Now, in this middle one here, you can see this allows me to select what my layout will look like. So if I untick the middle, you can see the middle one disappears from the picture. If I untick horizontal, you just get something that looks like this. If I untick right, yep, I think you get the idea. And then these 3 buttons, these 3 boxes, circles below, they just give you control over how you want the DIN and trunking to look. Do you want it to be gray trunking, white, detailed, non-detailed? Just some options for you. But I'm happy with these options. So I'm going to go into generate. And I'm just going to zoom back out. Okay. So you can see it placed my panel layouts, external views, front and the side views, and it also placed them perfectly in line. You can see it perfectly lines up, which is a lot easier to do it. It's a lot easier to have the API do it for you than for you to do it by hand. And it also created this for me. It also placed my DIN and trunking perfectly, and as well as the text telling me how wide its trunking is. As for the offset from the bottom, you can see I gave it a 50 offset, so it avoids the bolt. And once I've done that, I can simply place my devices on the panel just like what I did before. And I'm going to place some circuit breakers as well. Yep, you can see. And let's say once I've finished my panel out, I want to do an enclosure legends. So I'm going to do one right now and show you how to do that. Easiest way to do it is you select the page, you go to Tools, and you click Generate. And we want to generate a report. Go into the new enclosure legend. Now, this is very important. Where it says output format, you don't want this to be a separate page like what you see. You want this to be a manual placement, so you can place it, so it'll be on your cursor and you can place in the current page. Tick the current page. Choose a form. I'll choose this one because it looks nice. I click. And you can see here, these item numbers match here, match this table. It gives me a device tag, as well as the manufacturer and then which part number I'm using. It just makes the Sparky's job a lot easier when it comes to doing panel layouts. Now, let's say when you were doing your panel layouts, you did some trial and error, and as a result, all of these legend item numbers are marked up. Now, you could do what I just did, as in you can click on them, press F2 on your keyboard, brings up the manual edits. But if you have 100 components, you can't do that. So the way to fix this is, let me just update this first. So let's say we want to fix this now to be, 6, 7, 8 in sequence. The way we fix this is you go to 2D panel layouts. You go to your internal mounting panel, and you go right click, edit legend item. And you can see here, these are all your item numbers. And you can just go number, you do horizontal, vertical. You've got some options here. You go OK. And you can see those numbers have been fixed. And then once they've been fixed, we need to update the enclosure legends. So we just go update. And now it's looking much nicer. So if you do it this way, it saves you from having to manually renumber each of these devices. And just before we finish 2D, just a little something I want to mention. If you want to insert components vertically, like terminals vertically or relays vertically, you simply have to right-click anything here, and go settings. And you can choose direction, vertical, angle. You could do 90 or 270, up or down. So 90 is up, 270 is going down. Yeah. Now that that's done, I want to move on to 3D. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the panel layouts 2D. And I want to open up the layout space. So I'll go to Home, open up the navigator. I'm going to delete this, delete everything actually. So I'll do it from scratch. So you see how it works. To create a new layout space, which you just right click and go new. You can call this anything you want. And now this gives me a place where I can place my 3D panel layout. And to do that, I'm going to go to View and bring in my 3D mounting layout navigator. And what I do is I simply, and just like with 2D, I simply drag it into the 3D layout space. And I have a 3D object. If you want to view the 3D object from different angles, you click on this eye icon here. And you can see a view. However, this is not precise. So I recommend you use this cube here. You've got the home view, which is the default. You've got these faces. You can do angled views, isometrics. A lot of room to play with. Now, let's say I want to view just the gear tray. What you can do is you can hide doors or hide objects. Or a better way of doing this is you go to your layout space and you can see everything under the enclosure, the doors, and you can just double click on mounting panel or go to mounting panel front. And now you can see your mounting panel. Now to insert my trunking, I go insert, and then this one here, wire duct. Yep, pick a part. I'll just use this one with the 60 width trunking. And I can simply zoom in to make it easier. And I'll place something over here, let's say. And I can just go all the way across. I don't have to type in any numbers. And then I can do the same for the vertical trunking. I can click here. Now you can see I've got my trunking going overboard. So I press A. A changes handle position. And I'll go some amount down. Do the same as before. I won't go all the way down. I won't do the whole thing because of time. But yeah, you get the idea. Now, let's say I want my horizontal trunking to be 250 below this top. So what I can do is I go right click, and it's this one here, placement options, or I recommend you remember Control W by placement options. And then you can specify offsets. So we need to specify an offset of minus 250. We go OK. And this time we want to go A. Yep, so we'll do this corner. And you can see I've placed at a gap of 250. If I want to do a sanity check, I can just go home, and then measuring. And I select from the middle. Oh, come on. To the middle. And you can see dy, or difference in y, is 250. So sanity check passed. It's correct distance. Okay, come on. Anyway, with that being done, I want to place my DIN in the middle here. And you'll see it's much easier to do so. So if I go to insert, mounting rail, I'll select this DIN. And I'm not going to click here and guess where the middle is. I'm going to go right click, adopt length first. So I click on this one. So I've got the correct length. And then I go right click again, place centered. And then I click with the top one. And you can see it's placed in the middle. And then the final thing to do would be to just place components onto the mounting rail. So I can place them anywhere here. And they come in as a group. So that's one way of doing it. That's the manual way. A more efficient way will be to use the 3D panel generator. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to delete this. And then I'm going to select this MCC. I'm going to go to the PLG. And this is part of the PLG API, this one here, panel generator. If I click on that, let me zoom in so you can see. You'll notice this looks a lot similar to the other one. You know, we can select your cabinets, all that sort of stuff. I'm just going to leave this as is. and I'm going to generate. I'm just going to zoom out. So it created my it created the whole panel of the din and trunking. However, I'm not done, because after it created this, I also have the option of placing devices onto my din rail. So if I zoom back in, I can choose what do I want to place where. So I'll just place the circuit breakers first. I'll place the circuit breakers on UT1. So UT1's this top one here. And then I'll place the contactors directly below on UT3. So you can see I've made a list. I can also move stuff up and down or delete if I've made a mistake. But I haven't, so I'll just go place and I'll zoom out. Yep, it's been placed. And it also tells me it's been placed with this cray. See this cray here? So once I'm happy with that, if I zoom in, yep, I can see all the devices placed nicely right next to each other. Let me just. Then what I want to do is let's say I've got my panel layout done. I also want to do some mounting views, some model views. So I'm going to delete this. Now what I can do is I could do this from scratch. I could go insert view and then model view. I can external, internal, and then do the same for the drilling view. But the PLG has a tool that makes it a lot easier to do. So if I go back to the PLG, I have this model view gen here. So if I select the 3 pages that I want, my 2 model view pages and drill view, I select all 3 pages. I go model view gen. You can see select the layout space, select your pages, and just go place them. And if I start from the top, you can see it placed an external view isometric. It placed internal views, both the shading and the wireframe with the legend item numbers and tags. It's got all that placed, as well as a model view, as well as a drilling view. And lastly, I want to do some reports. So these reports, since we don't have time, I'm just going to go over them quickly. If I go generate, I've got an enclosure legend for my 3D panel layout, and I've got a cutting list with a filter for the din and trunking only. So I'm going to generate these reports and then show you what they look like. So for my internal enclosure legend, it's just like the one that I showed you for 2D. It shows you everything that I've placed in the 3D panel. So pretty straightforward. For the cutting list, this is actually a parts list, but it's a parts list where I've filtered it to only include the din and trunking. And the reason why I like to have this is if I go all the way to the right, I've got cutting lengths for each din and each trunking. So I know what needs to be cut and how much of it needs to be cut. And yeah,